Today we're going to talk about the emotion that drives more negative behaviors and addictive behaviors than any other emotion in existence, and also talk about the emotion that can pull us out of those behaviors. I'm Rob, and it's yes time. So today's topic, and then what we're going to discuss in modules 10 and 11, is shame and guilt. Shame is the preceding emotion, the number one emotion that drives addictive behaviors, that drives connection within our relationships. Shame is that one emotion that if we were able to consolidate one principle and teach this to clients that come into our office, it would be how to process through shame. This is why it's such an important topic for us to discuss today. Shame is one of those things that we all experience. We can't totally be rid of shame because we're human. And as human beings, we experience shame. And when it comes to behaviors that we know don't fit within our value system, shame has a tendency to be that primary overwhelming emotion that crushes us and creates repetitive acting out in negative behaviors. So let's dig into the nuts and bolts of guilt is. Oftentimes people want to say shame and guilt are the same thing. Actually polar opposites. Even though they can trigger somewhat similar emotions at times when we don't know how to separate them. In fact, guilt can quickly become shame, which we'll explain in just a minute. So we're going to go back to the two-part brain that we talked about in Module 1 to set a foundation of why shame can be that foundational emotion that drives negative behavior. Survival, avoiding pain, and seeking pleasure are the three prime directives of the limbic system. That limbic system is just trying to keep us alive. Remember, that limbic system doesn't have morals. It's amoral. Its job is to just simply survive and to keep us alive. It's kind of what we talk about as the 5-year-old brain that just keeps us in that state of survival. The prefrontal is this higher functioning part of our brain. So what happens is when we participate in a negative behavior and we experience shame, immediately what's happening is it's triggering the limbic system in a painful type of emotion. Webster talks about shame as being humiliation or being censured or doing something with reproach. It's kind of that emotion when I think of that puppy dog that's just been yelled at by its owner, and it feels like this. Just wants to close up. Shame creates emotions of being withdrawn, anger, frustration, confusion. Shame is this emotion that we want to run and escape from because it hurts so badly. It's one of those things that we just want to escape from as quickly as possible. Guilt, on the other hand, as defined by Webster, is a fact of having done something wrong or bringing something that we've done to a conscious state. Isn't that interesting? So on one hand, shame is defined as this humiliation or reproach, and guilt is defined as something that's factual or bringing a mistake to our conscience. So if we look at this from a brain standpoint, what shame is doing is it's keeping the emotions that we're experiencing stuck in this limbic, painful place. And when the limbic's job is to avoid pain, that's where these negative behaviors can have such a foundational premise. So something like drug addiction or pornography addiction or acting out in social settings in an unhealthy way or fighting or totally withdrawing. So many of our loved ones and children get into these cycles where the minute they start feeling shame and this pain that happens, they get into the cycle of withdrawing and not even wanting to engage. And so what often will happen is, as parents, you want to engage your child so that they give you some kind of a response. And what's interesting is if we push shame deep enough, it almost always requires a response. So if we corner someone and we push them into a shame mode, how dare you do that? What's wrong with you? That was a terrible behavior. And we sit there and push them, the response will usually be something like, I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me, or it'll be somewhat explosive. Or if it's not explosive, it'll be extremely penitent, but not for the right reasons. Shame drives this almost pseudo-penance or false kind of wanting to repair what was done, but it's not real. It's almost out of forced emotion to try to get rid of this pain that's taking place. So when a child is pushed into the corner of shame in order to get them to respond, and then they say, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again, out of shame, that is very short term. And as parents, it's really easy to get into this habit of using shame as a way to invoke a reaction from the child, because it works. Shame is so powerful because it's so painful that it works. Very short term though, and it always results in disconnection and withdrawn relationships from our loved one. And so the key in moving from shame into a healthier state is understanding guilt. And we're going to go there in just a minute. What will happen is we often talk about shame cycles when we meet with clients. And almost all of us as human beings experience shame cycles. I experience shame cycles, you experience shame cycles, and here's how a shame cycle works. When we've done something that we know we shouldn't do, and shame is the first emotion that we feel, the limbic system wants to get out of that pain. And so it will create some kind of a mechanism to avoid that pain, whether we withdraw. So for example, if we're fighting with a child and then we're experiencing shame because of that fight, we have that tendency to withdraw and to go and kind of feel sorry for ourselves or beat ourselves up. And because we're feeling the shame and beating ourselves up, we want to numb that shame somehow, whether that's through more withdrawing, it could be through an addictive substance, it could be through just getting to work on something instead of dealing with the issue. We go and we work as our addiction, or we eat food, or we go shopping, or we call and complain to our friends. Sometimes it's good to have that support, but whatever it might be, we want to get out of that shame. But because we haven't dealt with the core issue and the core relationship, we begin to feel shame again, which drives us right back into this cycle in the limbic system. So as we try to avoid the shame by not working through it and dealing with it, we feel more shame, which then continues to drive the negative behavior. In an addictive cycle, how shame works, so if you have someone in your family that's struggling with addiction, for example, let's say alcohol, is when they use alcohol, they will feel shame, perhaps not right immediately after, maybe it's a week, a day. For many addicts, it's immediately after they start feeling shame that they slipped, that they relapsed in their addiction. As soon as they feel that shame, the brain says, I need to avoid this pain. And so what's the best way for me to avoid this pain? Back to drinking. And we call this an addictive shame cycle. And then they feel more shame for drinking, and then they numb it by drinking. Then they feel more shame for drinking, then they numb it by drinking. And oftentimes addicts will say, I feel trapped. How do I get out of this? And that's exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about the shame cycles that they're experiencing. So when we're making an attempt to move out of this, what we'll call the quagmire of shame, or this quicksand, it's almost like shame is this quagmire where when we enter into it, we start sinking, and we slowly sink, and then it buries us, and we don't know what to do to get out. And we feel embarrassed to talk about it. And what happens is when we use guilt, guilt is actually the antithesis of shame. It's the healing property of shame, because guilt pulls shame up into the prefrontal cortex. It pulls our actions into the conscious mind, exactly like Webster defines it. This is why guilt and shame are so different, because with guilt, we're actually processing the behavior. Instead of saying, I am bad, guilt is saying the behavior was unhealthy. See the difference? Shame is about, I am terrible, I'm a rotten person, I'm the addict. Guilt says, I have a problem, and I need to do something about it. Guilt brings us into action. When we're accountable because of guilt, so here's the difference in accountability. When we're accountable out of shame because we're forced to confess, or forced backed into the corner, whatever it is, what happens is it just stays in that negative cycle, and it creates that relationship where I feel so kind of crummy inside and like I've disappointed those who love me that I don't want to associate with them as much because I'm so tired of disappointing them. What guilt does is it gives me a basis where I can go to those people and be accountable for the right reasons. Guilt says, hey, I made a mistake. I am sorry. I need to make some progress. So if a client were to come into my office and say, oh, I'm so tired of this addiction, I really need to work on it. And I was to say, yeah, it's just screwed up your life. What the heck are you thinking? I immediately would have moved them into a shame state. And that would create a disconnection, and they wouldn't want to come back. And surprisingly enough, I have had clients who have had those types of experiences, not just with family members, but with actual therapists. And so what we can do, and what you can do as a parent in your relationships with your child, is to begin, as hard as this can be sometimes, to process things out of guilt rather than out of shame. And we're going to talk about in chapter 10 how our children and how your child, whether they're an addict, whether they're having behavioral issues, or whether you're just feeling withdrawn, maybe they're a great kid, but you're just feeling that relationship isn't close enough. We're going to talk about what kind of shame they're experiencing, and we're going to dig deeper into that. In chapter 11, we'll start digging deeper into the shame that is felt by parents and loved ones, and how that so easily transfers over to our children and our spouses and those around us. So let's get real for just a minute about shame. This, just like the process we're talking about of getting closer in our relationships and creating this love and connection that will then create these behavioral changes, working through shame is probably one of the most fundamental cores of this process. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not something that we can just switch on and switch off. In fact, this is one of the things that, as I've been creating these modules, as I've been writing this book, I've struggled with internally as I've been creating this process. Because I say to myself, I still experience shame. How can I teach these principles when I'm still experiencing so much shame in my life? And then I realize, because we all do. I'm not any different. You experience shame, I experience shame, and it's something that we continually are working through in our lives. It's part of the human experience. And so to have this mythical place where shame doesn't exist, it's extremely unfair to even suggest to you that shame can be totally annihilated, because it can't. I mean, perhaps in some perfect place in our older age we can get to this point. I see even some of the most wise and gentle and kind people in their old age experiencing shame. And what the key becomes is learning to accept shame as part of the process of life and to acknowledge it. And instead of looking at ourselves as these terrible people for having shame, we can start seeing ourselves as human beings and accepting our shame for what it is. And once we're in this place of acceptance, once we're empathetic with ourselves and not beating ourselves up for feeling the shame, then we can acknowledge it and say, oh, now that I understand what this quagmire of quicksand is, once I understand what this shame is, I can gently start working through it. Once we understand how shame can envelop our relationships, and we can say, well, it's happening, or I made a mistake as a parent today, or whatever that might be, we can acknowledge it, and then we can make the reparation. And then we can have fewer experiences, or better said, more experiences where guilt takes the precedent rather than shame. And I just feel an extreme amount of empathy towards each of you as we teach this principle. Because the last thing that I want is for anyone to watch this and then to say, well, you know, how can I do this because I feel so much shame, or whatever you might be experiencing, because we're all there with you. We understand this. there's not a single one of us who has mastered this principle fully. Some of us might get better and better at it, and that's the key, is being able to acknowledge that shame and then gently move through that quicksand and take those things into a guilt type of a way. So for example, if you're having an interaction with a child and they're just driving you crazy, let's say they're asking for money and they won't stop pestering you for money. This is just a random example. Shame would be, how hard your dad and I work, or your mom and I work, and we just don't have any money. It's expensive already just taking care of the basic needs of this home. That type of a conversation will drive shame, where the child will think, oh, I'm a burden on my parents. And then they'll feel shameful for asking for the money. What guilt does is it takes it to a cognitive thing. Guilt would say, hey, you know what? I totally understand how much you want this money. I would love to be able to give it to you. In fact, let's talk about that. And so what happens is, instead of just bringing it down into that core, we don't have the money, we're poor, we can't afford it, you go into hey, let's have a conversation. Let's cognitively talk about what's going on and how much we love you. I would love to be able to give you that. I would love for you to be able to have the car or best clothing from the store that all your peers are wearing, whatever that issue is regarding finance. This is just one example. But learning to be aware and almost like it's being thrown at you, catch the shame and be aware of it, and then be able to process that in your transactions can be so healthy in starting to create these behavioral changes. So as we've worked with hundreds of clients through the emotions of guilt and shame, here are some of the things that we've seen happen. We'll have young adults or teenagers come into our office, and even some young children, and they'll say things like, there's no way I can ever be honest with my parents again. I'm tired of disappointing them. Or even to the extreme of, I hate my parents so bad that there's no way I'll ever talk to them again. And that's often the defense mechanism. So this avoidance of pain and the defense that the limbic system sets up due to shame becomes kind of this overwhelming, bubble within our need for survival and avoidance of pain. And the defenses are set up to where it becomes very illogical. It just is totally kind of like, doesn't make any sense at all. And when parents are communicating with their children and shame is involved, those conversations become very illogical very quickly, which can then draw into an engagement into a fight, because it doesn't make any sense. Because shame is kind of stuck in that 5-year-old place, that I'm not good enough, that I disappointed my parents, that I screwed up, and that I'm a failure, and that I've disappointed you, so I don't want to interact with you. And so if you force the interaction, I'm just going to submit out of force, or I'm going to explode. And so as parents start working through this shame with their kids, and they have these interactions where they process this shame, even if it feels illogical, and they do the motivational interviewing that we talked about. So they roll with the resistance, because resistance is all about being illogical. Resistance is all about being in this limbic system, trying to keep those defense mechanisms up. And then expressing empathy, when parents can go into that empathetic place, even if it's totally illogical, even if it doesn't make any sense. That begins to help move those shame sequences into the prefrontal, which then become guilt and accountability and processing and connection and love. And so what will happen with these clients that said, I hate my parents, I'll never talk to them again, we've had actual quotes that are along the lines of, well, my mom seems like she's really trying. That means a lot to me. These are these same kids who say, I'll never talk to him again. Or instead of my dad just lecturing me this time, he actually listened. These are comments coming from these same children who promised that they'd never communicate with their parents again. This transition doesn't have to take years. This transition can take a couple weeks. It might be a couple months. It might be a couple years. And that's another emotion I want to get across, is that as we as parents, as you and I are interacting with other parents who who are really, really struggling with their kids, what they need most from us is empathy, is kindness. Instead of judging them and saying, oh, you're doing this all wrong. Oh, hey, if you would just process out of guilt instead of shame, you'd do a lot better as a parent. Well, they don't understand what you're talking about. What they're really needing is for you to say, wow, you know, I've been there as a parent. That's so hard. I'm here for you. And what we often want to do is judge other parents in their process. Well, you know, I was able to really connect with one of my kids who was having problems. What's your problem as a parent? Why aren't you connecting? And that's how we often feel, because the best of parents, I have seen these all-star parents who far supersede my own ability in processing shame, who have kids that just don't want to connect, that as much effort as the parents put in, that sometimes it's this long process where the children just don't want to connect. And if you're in that position, I express a ton of empathy towards you. You're not alone in this. What's ironic is that long term, these parents who stay empathetic, yes, with boundaries and rules, but empathetic and process out of guilt rather than shame with their kids, most of these children over time, it might be 5 years, it might be 20 years. I've had parents that have come to me that said, I've always loved my child. They've just rebelled against whatever, for whatever reasons, and they haven't ever wanted to connect with me. But I'm always there for them, and they know I love them. And just a month ago, they totally came to me. They had hit their rock bottom place, and they were like, thank you so much for loving me so much. I'm ready to start making the changes. And that place could have seemed so distant, and it sometimes takes years to get there. But when we process out of empathy, and when we bring the shame into a place of guilt, that so greatly increases the chances of those who are struggling to see you as the example and to see you as the place to come to when they're ready to make the change. And then when they come to us and they say, what should I do? Then from motivational interviewing, you help them see through empathy what the discrepancy is, and then instead of telling them exactly what to do, you help them self-actualize. What do you think you need to do? We're here to support you in what you decide to do. Well, I really need to go to addiction recovery. Okay, you know, have you looked into things? Would you like us to look into some sources for you? We're here to support you in that process. And you kind of see how that works. And if a parent were to say, well, obviously, we've been saying for years that you need to go into addiction recovery treatment, are you ready to do that? That might bring back those feelings of shame, and they might withdraw again. So again, thank you so much for processing this with us. Looking forward to modules 10 and 11, where we'll process shame from the child and addict's perspective or behavioral issue perspective. And then module 11, where we're going to process shame from the parent's perspective and from the loved one's perspective. See you next time. So as far as actions go, for yourself, I want you to think back to when you were being raised by your parents or parent or whoever raised you. Was shame involved in that process? And if it was, how? Perhaps you can write that down. Perhaps that's just something that's something you just want to think in your mind, or you could share it with us at it'syestime.com. As far as your loved ones go, so say this is a child, a spouse, whoever this is, a grandchild, I want you to be vigilant in identifying a moment over the next few days where a behavior takes place. And I want you to be ready and prepared to process that behavior in a form of guilt rather than shame. So for example, let's say a child breaks a glass. Okay, something simple like that. A glass falls down and they break it because they weren't being careful. You would process that in guilt by saying, oh, that was interesting, what happened? Versus, oh, what were you thinking? Be more careful. See the difference? So be prepared to process something in a guilt format rather than a shame format. Always feel free to share your experiences. Ask your questions at it'syestime.com. We're there for you. In fact, we're looking forward to creating some videos in our members section just based off of your questions. And then as far as your reward goes, I want you to go to YouTube and follow the link that's included here to watch Brene Brown's video on shame. One of the most amazing videos. In fact, what we've been processing with clients for years out of the Yes Clinic, we actually have seen what the work that Brene Brown has done in researching shame and in researching vulnerability, and it's validated a lot of what we're currently doing, and we really appreciate the work that she's done, and we know that you'll really enjoy that video on shame.